And it's time sometimes to focus now on what happens beyond bankruptcy. Thomas Sugrue is one of the main speakers here at the Detroit Policy Conference. He's a historian, professor, and an author. He's also a native Detroiter who wrote the acclaimed book, Origins of the Urban Crisis, Race and Inequality in Post-War Detroit. We sat down with him to talk about Detroit's future.
Detroit needs to think about reinventing itself in a way that provides opportunity for the vast majority of the city's population, not simply focusing on the high visibility downtown development strategies that are necessary but not sufficient to the city's future, but really to think about how to improve the quality of life for people living in many of the surrounding neighborhoods that are often untouched by development and have been hardest hit by the city's crisis and by the national financial crisis.
People have been talking about problems in the neighborhoods for years, so this is not an easy task.
It is not an easy task. There has been depopulation and disinvestment and a lot of creative organizing to try to overcome it, but there aren't a lot of incentives for developers to invest in neighborhoods, and there are lots of obstacles in terms of the amount of commercial and residential abandonment.
Tom, we are excited about the enthusiasm of Detroit, the good things that are happening downtown, and yet the neighborhood's still losing population. Is it possible to start a turnaround while you're still losing population in your neighborhoods?
Ultimately, there's going to have to be a stabilization of the population in neighborhoods for the city to have the density and energy that it needs to survive in the long term. But that's going to require improving the quality of public services and especially the quality of public education. For so long as kids and parents feel like they're not getting adequately educated for the current economy, they're going to keep going out of the city to other communities.
And education is not on the agenda here today. It's been such a tough nut for us here in Detroit. It's almost as if we've given up talking about it. You're saying that without good schools, you're not going to have solid, stable neighborhoods.
I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, education is important for the stability of the city, but it's also important for giving folks the skills and the talent necessary to make their way in the 21st century economy, and to engage the world as intelligent citizens. And as long as our education system fails, I think the city is going to have real problems in achieving a true comeback.
Detroit's sort of your specialty, and I know that your family is from here too, that your parents grew up here in a neighborhood that now looks nothing like it did when they were there. I wonder though, can you think of another city that we should be looking to that has solved some of the problems that you point out that we're having and have not been able to solve in Detroit?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, right now there's so much experimentation going on in cities all over the United States, but I would say the general thrust of urban policy in the last 25, 30, even 40 years has been heavily focused on downtowns,
right,
heavily focused on attracting people with means to the city, heavily focused on gentrification. And Detroit in some ways is following the suit of other cities. And on the one hand, it's good. I mean, we need to bolster the city's tax base,
right,
which has been gutted over the last half century or more, but it's not going to be sufficient. So where have I seen some interesting experiments? There have been really strong grassroots-based community efforts to try to collaborate between city and suburb to push for better school funding and more interesting solutions to the problems of public education than simply small-scale, micro-level neighborhood interventions. That's one. There has been some very interesting community-based housing development in places as diverse as the Bronx and Cleveland. And one last thing, immigration has been vital to the transformation of cities. Los Angeles, Chicago, right, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, all of them have been remade by the energy, the capital, and the community rebuilding from the bottom up that immigrants, mostly from Latin America and Asia, have brought to those cities.
Okay, Tom, we've talked about in Detroit for years, though, the need for better public education. We talked about the need for delivery of services to people who live here and getting them working, but it never quite seems to happen. So we're still talking about it. How do we take the ideals and the things that we know should happen, how do we now make that happen? And how does this actually come to life here in the city after talking about it for so many years?
Yeah, well, what we need is political will. These changes aren't going to come simply from thinking good ideas. It's going to require building coalitions to affect state and federal policy. And really for the last 40 or 50 years, Detroit has been on the margins in Lansing. Cities have fallen out of favor in Congress and Washington. And cities and suburbs and small towns in different ways can forge coalitions to fight for renewed investment in neighborhood and downtown commercial districts, for better funding for public education, for transit. These aren't going to come simply by folks in Detroit trying to go it alone. We've tried that. It doesn't work. We need instead to reach out and make connections wherever possible, usually around a single issue, to push in the state capitol and to push in the national capital for the kind of investments that we need.
Tom, what are the cultural obstacles you see to Detroit's turnaround?
Well, one of the big obstacles is that, and this builds on the previous point, there's a long and unhappy history of city-suburban hostility in metropolitan Detroit. It's starting to change. You see some hopeful signs on the horizon. The inner-ring suburbs are getting more diverse and facing a lot of the same issues as Detroit. But that hostility, that climate of hostility, the sense that Detroit is responsible for its own problems, and it's not our problem if we're living in Milford or living outstate Michigan. We need to think about creative ways of challenging those assumptions, because the bottom line is the fate of the entire metropolitan area depends on having a healthy central city.
Race is the sort of powerful subtext through much of your work, and the racial animosity in this region and racial isolation. That's another problem with it. We don't really seem to ever talk about, okay, how do we address that and get past it? What are some of the ways that we might do it?
It is the most important underlying issue shaping the fate of metropolitan Detroit, other than the collapse of the city's economy over the last 60 years or so. And Detroit is one of the most racially segregated metros in the United States. Less so than it was in 1990,
sure.
Less so than it was in 2000. But the bottom line is that we have to confront head on the long-term and really poisonous legacies. Where you live determines your access to public goods, to education, to quality of life, to jobs. And until we break down some of the balkanization and barriers that separate people still by race and socioeconomic status in Metro Detroit, then we're not going to get at the nub of the problem, which is segregation costs, and everyone bears the price.